It looks like you can already see what the title is, so that's why Paul was saying that all of the songs that we sing were poetry. Well, that's true. In fact, all of the songs in the songbook are basically poetic, or poems. As far as Western poetry, there's a difference. Oriental poetry, though, and that's inclusive of Hebrew or biblical poetry, is a great deal of difference between what we think of as poetry. And what we have as our poetry is Western poetry as opposed to Eastern or Oriental poetry. The result of that, because we don't have poetry like they do, is that many times as we read the scriptures and we get to those poetic passages, we don't see the beauty that is actually found in the scriptures along those lines. Our poetry primarily is rhyme and meter. That's why you can put songs to them or music to them and make them to be songs. And I use the illustration there. Mary had a little lamb. Its fleece was white as snow, and everywhere that Mary went, the lamb was sure to go. We have a meter there that's very distinct in relationship to the syllables and the words that are found. And then you also have the rhyming that would be at the end of each line, which it doesn't really show in the way in which I wrote it out there. But that would be the nature of our type of poetry, which is Western type of poetry. Biblical poetry, or Oriental poetry, though, consists primarily of parallelism. It is sometimes referred to as thought rhyme, or sometimes logical rhyme, because instead of rhyming the words, what is taking place is a rhyming of the thoughts. Words don't necessarily rhyme, but the thoughts will in that regard. So in this lesson, what we want to do is to consider the various types of parallelism, or these thought rhymes or logical rhymes that are found in the scriptures. Obviously, we're not going to be able to cover all of them because, as it's been reported, 1/3 of the Old Testament is comprised of poetry. So obviously, I'm not going to try and cover 1/3 of the Old Testament in a lesson this afternoon. I'm sure all of you are thankful. You probably say you preach long enough as it is. So, but we can learn the basic forms of parallelism, and that's really what we want to look at, the basic forms of parallelism, or Hebrew poetry. And that will help us when we get to passages. Maybe we have difficulty understanding something. If it's written in parallelism, then it helps us to understand what one section or one part of it says. There are actually 3 basic types, but we'll go a little bit farther than 3 basic types in this lesson. What we oftentimes hear is synonymous parallelism. This is also called cognate parallelism. And so I might be giving you some new terms that you don't generally hear, because we just generally refer to it as synonymous parallelism. In this, the first line will say something, and then the second line comes along, and it gives the same thought as the first line, but it does so using different words. Now, sometimes, and if you remember when Brother Tim was going through Ecclesiastes, he would mention that there's or Proverbs, I mean. Yeah, Paul's going through Ecclesiastes. Tim went through Proverbs. Tim took a whole lot longer time, but Tim would talk about many times that there was a different slant or idea. The emphasis was a little bit different. Well, that's true in some respects, but it's basically saying the same thing. It's just giving it in different words. Let's look at a couple of examples. In the 15th Psalm in verse 1, Lord, who shall abide in thy tabernacle? Who shall dwell in thy holy hill? We can immediately see that when you break this down, the word abide is basically the same thing as dwell. Even as tabernacle corresponds, same thing as holy hill. Now then, could there be a little bit of difference between simply abiding and dwelling? Well, yes, if you want to look at it that way and dig into those words a little bit. But it's expressing the same thing. When you look at the word tabernacle as opposed to holy hill, well, it doesn't, obviously they don't mean the exact same thing. Is there a little bit different aspect that's being presented? Well, he's using different words to express the same thought. And that's why it's referred to as thought rhyming. But it's parallel. It's saying basically the same thing using different words. Another passage would be in Psalm 36 and verse 5. Thy mercy, O Lord, is in the heavens, and thy faithfulness reacheth unto the clouds. Well, mercy, and the word mercy there is a Hebrew word that's very difficult to translate into our English. It has many shades of meaning. I generally like the idea that it's translated sometimes as loving kindness. That's being expressed by that word that's translated mercy there. And so thy loving kindness, well, it corresponds to God's faithfulness. Now then, is loving kindness and faithfulness the same thing? Obviously not. But yet it's expressing the same idea, the same thought is being set forth, even as heavens and cloud. Well, we understand heavens and clouds to be two different things, basically, but in reality, it's expressing the same idea. And so, God's mercy or God's loving kindness or His faithfulness, it goes all the way throughout the world. In the heavens, the clouds, it expresses it totally. And so there you have a couple of examples, and these are just to get you started in looking at different aspects within the Scriptures of synonymous or cognate parallelism. The second type is referred to as antithetic parallelism. Anti very simply means opposite or against. And so in this one you have a first line that says something. The second line then is going to state the opposite or a contrasting thought from the first line. Now, in many respects, you can say that these things are saying the same thing. They are just taking opposite views of it. Many times, one is stated in positive terms, while the other is stated in negative terms. Well, if you're stating it in positive terms or negative terms, it's saying the same thing, just looking at it from different aspects, a positive or negative way. And so that's the idea that is behind antithetic parallelism. Again, let's look at a couple of examples. In Proverbs 10 and verse 1, a wise son maketh a glad father, but a foolish son is the heaviness of his mother. Well, here, obviously, wise and foolish, those present opposite ideas. Whereas a glad father and the heaviness of his mother, again, express opposite ideas. And so it's expressing, though, the same teaching, looking at it from a positive side in relationship to the wise son, or a negative way in looking at it from a foolish son. But the teaching is the same thing. It is just looking at it from opposite standpoints or contrasting standpoints. Another passage would be in Psalms 20 and verse 8. That they are brought down and fallen, but we are risen and stand upright. Again, you look at brought down is opposite of risen. Falling is basically the opposite of standing upright. Someone who stands upright or someone who's fallen over. Someone who's been brought down or someone who's risen. And so you have, again, opposite thoughts, even though it's teaching the same principle, the same idea. The thought is the same, expressed in different ways, positive and a negative way. The third basic one that we generally hear about is synthetic parallelism. This is many times referred to, or also referred to, as constructive parallelism, or compound parallelism, or apethic parallelism. In this, you have the first line, again, will say something. You will have a statement in the first line. The second line comes along and advances the thought, or it gives additional information. And so, in many respects, sometimes this second thought, or the first thought, would not be even complete without the second. But it's going to give additional information. It's going to advance the thought a little bit farther. A couple of examples again. First, Psalm 85 and verse 12. Yea, the Lord shall give that which is good, and our land shall yield her increase. The first line gives a principle here. God is going to give that which is good. Now, you can apply that in many respects. So here's the second line comes along and gives us the additional information that he's discussing here, that the land would yield its increase. Now, if he was talking about something else, he could have added a second line that would have been different from this line and expressed additional thought regarding that subject. But here he's dealing with, here's God is good. He gives that which is good. There's your principle. Then the additional thought, the land is going to yield its increase. In Proverbs 15 and verse 3, it says that the eyes of the Lord are in every place, beholding the evil and the good. And so the first line tells us really one of the aspects or the characteristics of deity. God's eyes are in every place. In other words, he is omnipresent. He is in every place. But then the second line gives us additional information. And it's an important passage because a lot of times we might even omit this second verse in our thinking if Solomon had not stated it. That is, God sees both the evil and the good. In other passages, we see that God's eyes are upon the righteous. His ears are open unto their prayers, but the face of the Lord is against them that do evil, for example, in 1 Peter 3 and verse 12. And so we might get the mistaken idea that God doesn't see the evil. His face is against them. But now then, Solomon lets us know the omnipresence of God, that he sees everything. Not just the good, but now then he also sees the evil. And so he's giving us additional thoughts, additional ideas, or additional information as to, in this case, the very nature of God and his being truly omnipresent. And so we gain information through that second line. Well, that's synthetic parallelism. Those really are the ones that we generally talk about. Then there's some others that we don't like to talk about because they're a little bit more difficult. Especially this one, chiastic or introverted parallelism. In this, you have two lines. They contain two corresponding phrases in each line with different words. But the order of the words are reversed in the second line from the first line. Sometimes, and I've even heard someone, I think, refer to this as Abba parallelism. Now then, Abba, there's a reason. A, B, B, A. That's really the way in which it is demonstrated. A, B in the first line. The second line, B, A. The A's are synonymous, saying the same thing, different words again. The B's are synonymous. Generally speaking, the A's and B's are going to be antithetic to each other. And so you have a statement in the first line, a statement that says one thing, that says and is presented the opposite way in the second part of the first line. And then in the second line, that second part is stated in a different way than the first line, the second part of the first line. And then you have the latter part of the second line, which corresponds to the first part of the first line. The reason it's called chiastic is that it is using the Greek letter chi. It looks like a big X. And so you have, just draw an X, and that's chiastic type of parallelism. Now then, let me give you a few examples. The 91st Psalm in verse 14. Because he has set his love upon me, therefore I deliver him. I will set him on high, because he hath known my name. The idea that is expressed in he has set his love upon me corresponds to the latter part, because he hath known my name. They're saying the same thing in different words. And so there's the first part and the last part of the phrase, or of course saying the same thing. But then that second part and that third part are going to be saying the same thing as well. Him will I deliver corresponds to I will set him on high. And so you've got 1, 2, 3, 4 in that case. The 1 and 4 correspond, the 2 and 3 correspond. That's your chiastic parallelism. Another illustration, the 23rd Psalm, or Proverbs, verses 15 and 16. My son, if thy heart be wise, my heart shall rejoice, even mine. Yea, my reins shall rejoice when thy lips speak right things. Now, when you look at that, my son, if thy heart be wise, if thy lips speak right things, you're dealing with the same type of an idea being presented in the first line, the first part of it, and the last part of the second line. the second and the part of the first line, and the first part of the second line, though, my heart shall rejoice, corresponds to my reins shall rejoice. Well, if we didn't understand that last part, my reins shall rejoice, what's he talking about there? All I have to do is go back to the latter part of the first line, my heart shall rejoice. That's what he's talking about, except he expresses it with my reins shall rejoice. It's the same idea, the heart and the reins. One other illustration of this one, and this one's found in the New Testament actually, and that is 1 Timothy 3, verse 16. Without controversy, great is the mystery of godliness. Now notice, this one has 6 parts. God was manifested in the flesh, justified in the Spirit, seen of angels, preached unto the Gentiles, believed on in the world, and received up into glory. Now then, basically when you have these 6 parts, you have 2 X's. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6. And so you have 2 X's that would be there. And so when you look at it, the idea that God was manifested in the flesh corresponds to preached unto the Gentiles and corresponds to believed on in the world. Then the second part, or that second and third part, correspond along with the 6th part. Justified in the Spirit corresponds to seen of angels and corresponds to received up into glory. Now then, I'll introduce an aspect here. This is progressive in nature. Now then, as I say, we'll get to that in a couple of minutes, because so far in all of the others we've dealt with the basic forms. This one's progressive in nature as opposed to being basic chiastic parallelism. So just remember that as we come back to it. The next type is emblematic parallelism. This basically uses a simile or metaphor to convey the thoughts. A metaphor, well, both metaphor and simile, both are figures of speech, but a metaphor, a figure of speech in which an implied comparison is made between 2 different things that have actually something important in common. You could say that, I'll use Paul as an example. Paul is as hard-headed as this podium. And didn't that wake everyone up? Well, Paul is a podium. That would be a metaphor. But he's dealing with a hard head that way. You have placed the individual in that situation as, or you placed it being that object. A simile is like or as that. Paul's is likened to a podium. Instead of Paul is a podium, Paul is like, or he is as a podium. And being hard-headed. Now then, y'all can discuss his hard-headedness with him, but that's used just as an illustration of a simile and a metaphor. They're the same thing, except a simile uses the word like or as. Now me, I don't know why they separated the two into metaphor and simile. I have trouble remembering which is which all the time. But those are your 2 different types. Let's look at a couple of examples in this. Song of Solomon, chapter 4 and verse 1. And I was just thinking, I don't believe I've ever used Song of Solomon as a sermon before. Now then, if you go home and read Song of Solomon, you might understand why. But Song of Solomon 4 and verse 1. Behold, thou art fair, my love. Behold, thou art fair. Thou hast dove's eyes within thy locks. Thy hair is as a flock of goats that appear from Mount Gilead. Now he uses two figures of speech here. And both of them are what we're talking about. The first one, thou hast dove's eyes within thy locks. He has dove's eyes. That's a metaphor. He has likened that characteristic of dove's eyes to his love. On the other hand, he then says, thy hair is as a flock of goats. When he uses the word, or the word as is used here, it makes it a simile. Again, the hair is used, or the flock of goats, there's the comparison that is being made. But when he says as, makes it a simile. Now then, I would not see the beauty of hair being described as a flock of goats, but again, that's, I guess, more, I see a couple others shaking their head, no, I don't see that either, but that shows the aspect of making a comparison. Even though we might not use that comparison today, we might use something else. So husbands, I wouldn't suggest saying that to your wives, but no. Another passage, the 23rd Psalm in verse 1. The Lord is my shepherd, I shall not want. Here, Jehovah, or Yahweh, is likened unto a shepherd, but he's using a metaphor. He does not use the Lord is as my shepherd, or the Lord is like my shepherd. He is saying the Lord is my shepherd. And so with this, because of the comparison that's made, it's showing that trying to show God's guidance, His protection, His care over us, as a shepherd would be with the flock, so God is with us. And if you wanted to delve into the 23rd Psalm a little bit more, you have really a continuation of thought. I shall not want. Everything really in verses 2 and following is based upon that phrase, I shall not want. And so he is expanding, synthetic parallelism, the thought of I shall not want. Now then you can go home and study that yourself. But he uses a metaphor to God, or Jehovah, is my shepherd. In Song of Solomon 2 and verse 9, we have a simile here. My beloved is like, there it makes it a simile, like a roe or a young hart. Behold, he standeth behind our wall. He looketh forth at the windows, showing himself through the lattice. And so here, her beloved, who she's referring to Solomon, and it's a Shunammite woman, is like a roe, is like a young hart. That's a simile because she uses that word like. doesn't say that my beloved is a roe or a young hart. That would be a metaphor. But she is depicting in this the speed at which he is coming to her and the desire that he has of seeing her. That's what she is expressing with this simile, the speed of a roe or a young hart. And so he is likened to that. Well, that's emblematic parallelism. Then there's climactic parallelism, or sometimes it's called stair-like or gradation parallelism. In this one, the thought of the first line is actually completed in the second line. But the difference in this is that the first line would not be complete by itself. The second line has to be there in order to complete the thought of the first line. While synonymous parallelism, you might have the completion of a thought, yet the thought would be complete without the second line or the additional lines. That would be the situation in the 23rd Psalm. The Lord is my shepherd, I shall not want. That's a complete idea. He elaborates upon it in the rest of the psalm. But the thought would be complete, I shall not want. In climactic parallelism, that line would not be complete. There's your difference. An example, the 29th Psalm in verse 1. Give unto the Lord, O ye mighty. Give unto the Lord glory and strength. That first line, give unto the Lord, O ye mighty. If you stop there, you have an incomplete thought. Give what? And so the second line gives us the completion of the thought, give unto the Lord glory and strength. You see, that first line by itself, we're left to wonder, give what? What are we supposed to give? The second line then gives us the additional information that completes the thought of the first line, give unto the Lord, O ye mighty. Well, give what? Well, give him glory and strength. And so it completes the thought of the first line. In the latter part of Exodus 15 and verse 6, and I put the entire verse up there, but starts out, fear and dread shall fall upon them. By the greatness of thy arm, they shall be as still as a stone. Now then, here's the part that I want to center upon. Till thy people pass over, O Lord, till thy people pass over which thou hast purchased. The first part of that line, till the people pass over, O Lord, is incomplete without the second line, till the people pass over which thou hast purchased. And so you would be asking, what people passing over? Well, he's dealing the people which thou hast purchased. And so the second line completes the thought of the first line, but the first line is incomplete without the second part. That's the idea of climactic or stair-like or gradation type of parallelism. Now then, I mentioned before in 1 Timothy 3:15 regarding it being progressive in nature. Well, you have internal as opposed to progressive or external parallelism. Now, what's the difference between these? Internal parallelism is only when it contains 2 lines, nothing more. We've looked at a lot of those. In fact, most of the ones that we've looked at only contained 2 lines. And thus they were internal parallelism. You could say that it was synonymous internal parallelism, if you wanted to be really technical about it, or antithetic internal parallelism, or chiastic internal parallelism. But it only has 2 lines, and thus it's internal. When it is progressive or external parallelism, then it has more than 2 lines. It might be 3 lines. It might be a dozen lines. It might be 20 or 30 lines. Now, I'm exaggerating there, but they're saying that it's saying or using parallelisms. You just have to look at it more than that. Good illustration, the first Psalm. You have the first 3 verses, and then you have the second 3 verses. And they are, using parallelism, giving synonymous or synthetic parallelism, but it's progressive in nature because there's more than just 2 lines. And then within that, if you look just at those first 3 verses, you have different ones. The first verse is synthetic progressive parallelism. Why? Because you have 3 thoughts in each one, giving that completion or giving additional information. Blessed is the man that walketh not, or that walketh not in the counsel of the ungodly. There's your first line. Nor standeth in the way of sinners. Then the third line, nor sitteth in the way of the scornful. And each one is building upon the other one. You have 3 lines, though, instead of just your 2. And so that makes it a progressive parallelism or external parallelism. And you could say the same thing that we said. You could use it, if you're wanting to be technical, synonymous external parallelism or so forth. And so we need to understand that aspect. It's not always just 2 lines. Sometimes it's multiple lines. Now then, one other type of poetry that we run across, and this is really just touching the hem of the garment as to parallelism and a study of it, but that is acrostics. Acrostics is where each succeeding line or verse or series of verses begins with the next succeeding letter of the alphabet. Our alphabet, of course, A, B, C, D. And so the first line starts with the letter A. The second line starts with the letter B. The third line starts with the letter C, and so forth, all the way through Z. And thus, 26 lines is what we would have. Well, the longest acrostic, and probably best known in the Bible, is the 119th Psalm. It is an acrostic. It is comprised of 176 verses. Each letter of the alphabet, the Hebrew alphabet, is used to begin a line 8 times. In fact, in most Bibles, they divide it, and they'll have Aleph, then Beth, Gimel, and those sections. And each one of those sections are 8 lines. Why? Because that first section, 8 lines, or 8 verses, each one of them begins with the Hebrew letter Aleph. And then in that second section of 8 verses, each verse begins with the second Hebrew letter, Beth. So it's an acrostic. except it's using 8 lines instead of just 1. The Hebrew alphabet has 22 letters. So if a psalm has 22 verses, or a multiple of 22 verses, then there's a good possibility, not always the case, but there's a good possibility that it's an acrostic. Now then, of course, acrostics do not really come over into translation. How could they come across as far as translation is concerned from one language to another language? We have 26 letters in our alphabet. The Hebrew only had 22. Well, you try and work that out as far as being an acrostic in translation from the Hebrew into the English. You can't do it. It's an impossibility. And so we miss the acrostic nature of it. A good study, and we won't really deal with it, but why would the writers use an acrostic as far as poetry? You might ask the question, why do people today use acrostics to teach something? And you might have your answer as to why they were used in the Old Testament. Now, I mentioned the 119th Psalm. There's some other acrostics. The entire book of Lamentations is an acrostic. The first chapter, you have 22 verses. You have an acrostic of 22 verses. Second chapter, you have 22 verses. The third chapter, guess what? You've got 66. In other words, it goes through it 3 times in the third chapter. Fourth chapter, it goes back again to 22, and so forth. So the entire book is an acrostic. It's also poetry. The 9th Psalm, the 10th Psalm, the 25th Psalm, the 34th Psalm, the 37th Psalm, the 111th Psalm, the 112th Psalm, the 145th Psalm, all of those are acrostics. There's probably more. But then as I was studying, I found out the 31st Psalm, Proverbs, verses 10 through 31, who can find a virtuous woman? That's an acrostic that is set forth for us as far as the virtuous woman. Now, these passages that we've dealt with are really just the beginning of a study of poetry, the poetry of the Bible. You can get into a lot more detail than what I've gone through. I've given you the basic forms of poetry and tried to give some illustrations of them. But there's also some poetry or use of parallelism in writing that is not considered poetic. Sometime, if you just take the time to study 1 John, John uses in 1 John parallelism. Sets forth the idea and many things relating to that idea in the first section, and then he repeats it in using different idea in second section, in the third section, and fourth section. You see the same thing in relationship to 2 John, using the terms, for example, commandment, then truth, and then doctrine in that second epistle that he wrote. He's saying the same thing using different terms. So it's parallelism that is being used in that book, even though it's not considered poetic. The book of Revelation, the entire book is, to a great extent, parallelism that John presents. Here's something coming out of heaven that he sees, and he goes through it, and then he basically, to a certain extent, starts over again with another picture that's coming out of heaven for him. And then he starts over again. Well, he's using parallelism in his writings. And so, an understanding of the way in which the Bible uses poetry can help us understand certain verses and certain passages. I've used, for example, the idea that in 2 John When you get to verse 9, the doctrine of Christ, what is it? Is it the doctrine about Christ as someone, or the doctrine that comes from Christ? Well, when you see the parallelism, you immediately know that it's a doctrine coming from him, or it's the same thing as commandments, his commandments, or the truth. And so it can help us in understanding certain things within the Bible. And it can help us understand in our understanding of what a passage is teaching. And that's why I wanted to present this afternoon, to help us in our understanding of God's Word, so that we can, as we sit down and study these things, we can have a greater understanding and a greater knowledge of it, and a greater appreciation of the Word of God, that Word that He has so bountifully given unto us. If you're not a Christian this afternoon, then we encourage you to become such. If you are, but you need to respond, to repent, and let us pray with you, we would encourage you to do that this afternoon then, as we stand and sing the invitation song.